We believe that what God looks at in the heart of a person is most often our attitude and not necessarily our actions, because actions can just be a front sometimes. But a godly attitude will bring about good actions from a surrendered heart. Good morning. I'm Pastor Ernie Lewis of the Blue Point Church in Sisney, Illinois, with your thoughts for Monday. The Bible teaches us that there are so many godly attitudes that we should have if we're going to be obedient to the Lord and follow His direction in our hearts and in our minds. Paul directs the church at Philippi in Philippians chapter 4 to do some work on their thinking, on their meditating. He says in verse 8, "Finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, and whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there's any virtue or if there is anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things." You know, when we are allowing some thoughts to fill our head, we have to consider what things are true. That doesn't just mean that you read it somewhere on Facebook or maybe it was reported by the news. We really need to do our diligence to prove that those things are worthy of our consideration before we indelibly print them in our vault. He also calls for believers to only think on those things that are noble. You know, the idea of noble means only things that will be considered morally just or upright. Those things that are virtuous in their subject matter as well as describing the actions of others, noble thoughts. He calls for us to think about things that are just, which could mean impartial or unbiased. Maybe we're unprejudiced about that person or that action that we are thinking about. And when we think on things that are lovely, we're considering the things that are nice, that are good thoughts, maybe attractive to us and others for that matter. These thoughts are pleasant and enchanting. That would change our attitude. And that is quite a contrast to the kind of thoughts that this world tries to fill our minds with day after day. He finally calls for our thinking to be focused on things that are of good report. If this is like a story or a television show, maybe a book that we're reading, what kind of reviews would God give that story before we allow it to take up space in our mind and influence our thinking? And finally, he said, if there is any virtue, which means real value or some good quality, even uprightness about this thing that we're considering. Or if there's anything praiseworthy. Now, I take it to mean that these items cause us to praise God instead of, actually praising others. What kind of thoughts do they invoke in my mind? And after we've taken all the reports from others or things that we've heard on the radio or television, and we've passed them through this filter of merit and virtue that Paul has given us here, then we can consider those things. I really think that meditation is a lost art nowadays, especially whenever it's coming to thinking about things that are good and wonderful. We don't seem to do that much. We seem to think on just the opposite. And Paul gives this word finally at the beginning of the verse because he's been talking about thanksgiving. He's been talking about rejoicing and prayer and even the peace that God gives us. Finally, brethren, think on these things. He finally calls us to meditate on some acceptable things in order to be pleasing in our attitude before the Lord.